The Fallout series covers an expansive and detailed alternate history of the post-World War II United States, but perhaps no event along that timeline has defined the games as much as the day nations across the globe entered into an all-out thermonuclear conflict that plunged humanity into a centuries-long dark age, the day that marked the Great War of 2077.
This, our country and all its people, could be in danger of nuclear attack. In minutes by enemy missiles. In hours by enemy aircraft. Our cities, our farms, our factories. Prime target would be our air bases. With all our aircraft on the ground, our weapons of interception or retaliation not instantly available, we might face another and infinitely more costly Pearl Harbor.
The Great War both began and ended on Saturday, October 23, 2077. Over the course of just 2 hours, every nuclear-capable nation released thousands of warheads, resulting in billions of deaths and the collapse of most government institutions. The volley of nuclear weaponry was so intense it caused irreversible changes to entire ecosystems, the climate, and even geographical regions. Humanity and most life on Earth was nearly wiped out. But this abrupt and devastating conflict didn't come out of nowhere. It was the result of decades of growing international tensions, especially between the US and China. The dwindling availability of critical resources like petroleum was often a catalyst for these tensions. The Sino-American War notably led right into the Great War. These two wars could even be considered one and the same, but because of how disproportionately devastating the Great War was compared to every other conflict in history, it is often considered to be its own distinct event. It has sometimes been referred to as World War III. The morning leading up to the Great War started at 12:03 a.m. Eastern Time when unknown submersible objects were sighted off the coast of California by the United States Pacific Fleet. At 3:37 a.m., a squadron of high-altitude bombers were sighted off the Bering Strait and believed to be Chinese. Sometime later at 9:13 a.m., the Integrated Operational Nuclear Detection System issued an alert that 4 missiles were launched and of possibly Chinese origin. The United States government in response went to DEFCON 2. 4 minutes later, NORAD issued confirmation that missiles were launched and were inbound to the U.S. At 9:26 a.m., the President ordered a retaliatory strike according to response scenario MXCN-91. Little is known about the protocol except that it involves striking China with nuclear weapons and possibly many more strategic targets across the globe. At 9:42 a.m., nuclear bombs hit Pennsylvania and New York. Some conflicting reports suggest the West Coast was hit first, which gave residents on the East Coast more warning to seek shelter. Those initial strikes were quickly followed by a volley of nuclear warheads landing across the country over the course of several minutes. The resulting electromagnetic pulses began disabling critical power and communication systems across the country. The standard nuclear weapons used during the conflict were strategic nuclear warheads ranging from 200 to 750 kilotons in explosive yield. These were complemented by high-yield variants that were launched from Chinese submarines strategically placed off U.S. coasts. While the explosive range was far less, the lower-yield warheads ended up resulting in greater long-term ecological consequences as they deposited more soil and debris into the lower atmosphere, resulting in a much more concentrated fallout. Washington, D.C. would be hit only a few minutes after the initial strikes, causing the federal government to go quiet. Many of the clocks in the region became frozen at 9:47 a.m. due to the electromagnetic pulse. They would mark the exact moment the first bomb detonated in the region for centuries after. The resulting collapse of a centralized command and control makes precise tracking of what followed impossible, but there were numerous eyewitness accounts from people who survived the war that can fill in some of the gaps. In nearby West Virginia, a group of technicians reported seeing bright lights on the horizon and clouds of fire in the sky during the morning. They wrote about what they saw in a terminal to be found by survivors decades later. A U.S. Army soldier equipped with power armor witnessed missiles falling out of the sky elsewhere in the state. A person who would later be more widely known as the sole survivor was enjoying the morning with their spouse and infant son at their home near Concord, Mass. They were preparing for an event at a local veterans hall later that day. Their mourning was interrupted when news reports about the nuclear detonations in Pennsylvania and New York started coming in. The family evacuated to Vault 111, having previously been accepted into the program. These public fallout shelters were built by the Vault-Tec Corporation across the country as part of an effort led by the U.S. government known as Project Safe House. The sole survivor and their family escaped into the vault right as a mushroom cloud appeared near Boston. A relative few were able to reach the safety of their assigned vaults. They either failed to reach it in time or stayed behind believing the air raid sirens signaled another drill. Many of these vaults secretly performed experiments on those who did make it in time, as well as their descendants who continued to live underground in the preceding decades. The first few weeks after the war were hellishly brutal for the survivors. They began to raid for supplies, fighting each other for resources. Some people even formed scavenging gangs. Diseases and illness became widespread as many slowly succumbed and eventually died from radiation sickness. Suicide was common after the war as well. Emergency response units and elements of the National Guard were mobilized, but their ability to provide aid to victims and refugees was severely hampered by the lack of any centralized command and control. The few remaining hospitals and triage areas became overrun to the point that whiskey and painkillers soon became the only care available to most patients. The military tried to bolster relief efforts, but the growing number of deaths and rapid collapse of civil society resulted in their morale crumbling. Many ended up deserting their post. But the brutal infancy of the New World would soon see most of these survivors dying off. In a sense, it was the last weakened gasp of the Old World, and what could easily be assumed was the extinction of the human race. But that was not where the story of humanity was destined to end. People over time started re-emerging from the smoldering ashes of the old world to rejoin the few who remained on the surface. They came from public vaults and personal fallout shelters. They would discover a brutal and lawless world where mutations and extreme scarring from radiation was not uncommon among its inhabitants. This new wave of survivors started forming settlements and tribes. In the decades to follow, some pockets of humanity even began to rebuild. The civilized world mostly consisted of small communities that had banded together to protect themselves against human raiders, madmen, mercenaries, the elements, and mutated animals. But there were some examples of larger factions. The first true post-war constitutional republic was founded in 2186 when the settlement of Shady Sands used its considerable influence as a trade hub to reform into the new California Republic. The nation-state would grow from there to include what was formerly the southwestern region of the U.S. While the NCR had its own share of problems, it was able to establish a representative government, public schools, hospitals, utilities, and judiciary system throughout most of its territory. Within the ruins of Boston, a thriving community would emerge around Fenway Park. The settlement became known as Diamond City and was seen by many as a beacon of safety and hope amid the brutal decay of the Massachusetts wastelands. Beyond the settlements and burgeoning nations were many more examples of people banding together to improve their corner of the wasteland. A person known as the Vault Dweller would leave the safety of Vault 13 for the first time in their life, December 5, 2161, to find a new water chip so their community wouldn't die. Following their exile from the vault they saved, they would go on to start the thriving city of Aurora with a group of fellow Vault Dwellers and wastelanders. The Responders are a volunteer disaster relief organization formed shortly after the war in West Virginia. The group consisted of surviving first responders like police officers, firemen, and paramedics who were further supported by other local volunteers. They were dedicated to helping their community survive in the aftermath of the war. The group would unfortunately see their demise, but would inspire a new group to take up their name and mission several years later. The Underground Railroad in Boston would be founded to help organic robots known as synths escape a secret society of scientists called the Institute, believing them to be sapient like humans. The Institute was able to create them with technology that far outpaced the rest of the wasteland, with the group tracing its origins back to the old world academic institutions in the area. Project Purity was established by a group of scientists and engineers in the Capital Wasteland. The region consisted of Washington, D.C., alongside the former states of Maryland and Virginia. Columbia, as the region was possibly called before the war, was among the 13 commonwealths the U.S. Congress established in 1969 to further split up the country as a hedge against communism. The aim of Project Purity was to invent a new water filtration system to provide unirradiated water to the people living around the Potomac River near D.C. The Lone Wanderer, who played a crucial role in providing clean drinking water in the region, also co-wrote the Wasteland Survival Guide with Maura Brown in 2277. The guidebook provided critical information on how to survive the nuclear waste and became popular along the East Coast. The Lone Wanderer would go on to become a folk legend in the region. The tagline of the series is "War never changes," but more broadly it can be argued human nature doesn't change. For with all the depravity and horrors that can be found across the wasteland, there are also many examples of the best of humanity, the helpers and protectors who live by moral codes even in a world that favors the ruthless. The worst day in human history, the one that nearly wiped out our civilization, wasn't enough to destroy our humanity.